Just Fair is a UK-wide civil society organisation, and we focus on what's called everyday human rights. That's our economic, social and cultural rights. As an organisation, our goals include for the UK government, governments and public authorities to be effectively held to account in relation to their current everyday rights obligations. And secondly, we want these everyday rights to be effectively incorporated into our domestic laws across the UK. And by effectively, we mean so that everybody is able to actually enjoy their everyday rights. And just to situate our conversation today, during London Challenge Poverty Week, we are looking at the right to an adequate standard of living. It's a right contained within the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And I've included a slide here with quick oversight of the main rights it contains in plain English. But some key things to remember about that international covenant. It is a piece of international human rights law. It is about the essential conditions needed to live a life of dignity and freedom. And it was ratified by the United Kingdom in 1976 and so is legally binding. I'm just going to zoom in on the topic of our event today, Article 11 of that international covenant, the right to an adequate standard of living. This is a plain English version of the right, but the original text does specify that the right includes the right to food, clothing, and housing, including to be free from hunger. What we've experienced is that a huge amount of thought and work has gone into examining food and housing under this right. Indeed, both have received detailed thought from the Committee of Experts at the United Nations who oversees this covenant in the form of what are called general comments. This is largely right and proper. Food and housing are absolutely fundamental to people being able to live lives of dignity and freedom. But today we want to go further and look at some of the unexplored and some of the underexplored aspects of the right to an adequate standard of living. We do this because rights are universal and rights are indivisible. And unless we understand how particular issues impact upon the enjoyment of rights of particular groups of people in our society, we will not be able to achieve proper enjoyment of these rights. Rights demand that we continue to examine and to shine a spotlight where people and communities experience additional barriers and what the causes of those barriers are. And while clothing does get a mention in the right in the covenant, in the text, as I'm sure Luke is going to touch upon later in this session, it's an area that's got a lot less attention. So finally, for my opening remarks in terms of situating things, I just wanted to highlight that this comment from the United Nations committee that oversees the covenant, and they make it really clear that the list of issues contained in the text of the right, as a reminder, that's food, clothing and housing, was not intended to be exhaustive. So I'm really delighted that you're all joining us to dig a little deeper into this right today with our expert speakers and to examine and challenge those barriers people face in the realisation of the right to an adequate standard of living. I'm now going to introduce our first speaker, who is Eva Watkinson, but before I do that, I'll just stop sharing my screen. And Eva has over 15 years experience as an economic justice campaigner. Eva has worked on both national and international justice issues, including working for the UK housing charity Shelter, campaigning to stop multinational companies dodging taxes while at ActionAid UK, and as a campaigner at UNICEF. Eva is currently head of campaigns at Debt Justice, and she leads the organisation's public mobilisation and campaigning work, calling for an end to the poverty and inequality caused by unjust debt. So I'm delighted to welcome Eva. And I will share your presentation now.
Well, thank you very much for that intro. So yeah, just to maybe say a little bit more about who we are. So we were called Jubilee Debt Campaign, which sort of some of you may have heard of. We rebranded a couple of years ago. And we also traditionally worked on sort of global South debt. Sort of sovereign debt. But about sort of 6 or 7 years ago, we started to work on household debt as well, as we kind of recognised that was an area where debt levels are rising and it was becoming more of a problem in the UK. So yeah, that's sort of, I'm obviously primarily going to talk about kind of the UK's household debt crisis in this talk, and kind of what some of the impacts are, and kind of what we see as some of the solutions. And I know obviously there's loads of kind of expertise in the room, so kind of, yeah, really interested to hear what people have to say when we get into the discussion a bit later on. But I'm just going to go sort of, first of all, I guess, sort of give a little outline of the crisis, which is on the next slide. So that's, yeah, there's nearly 10 million people are kind of now over indebted, which means that they're behind on bills or kind of finding debt repayments a heavy financial burden. And kind of MAPS has calculated that 9.3 million people need debt advice, although I know that there's a few organisations think that's quite an underestimate. And there's actually, you know, a lot kind of bigger need for sort of debt advice out there, basically. But essentially, yeah, sort of debt levels on kind of things like energy debt, council tax, kind of credit card spending has all kind of been going up quite a lot in the last few years. And yeah, we'll sort of get into some of the reasons behind that a bit later on. But yeah, just on this next slide, there's a quote from someone called Astra Taylor, who is a kind of a debt campaigner who's based in the States, where they've done quite a lot of work. It kind of stemmed from the kind of Occupy movement, actually, like quite a long time ago, if people remember that, after the 2008-2009 financial crisis. But from that, I think sort of groups formed around debt and debt campaigning. And I guess sort of that, I think the quote, that quote is a kind of a nice reminder that actually it's, you know, people aren't going into debt because, you know, they kind of choose to, but it's because they're kind of forced to a lot of the time. And I think we talk about this in our kind of I guess our sort of parlance, like, is, you know, the sort of quite dry term of like negative budgets, which I'm sure is a term that we kind of use quite a lot, but essentially means that people aren't bringing in, you know, they're not earning enough to kind of live, essentially, and then that's leading to more, you know, people going into real debt, and yeah, and as Astra says, sort of being denied the means to live. But I think it's just quite a nice, it's quite a useful quote to keep coming back to, I think. But yeah, so I think just to get into a little bit more about why there is so much debt and kind of why it's going up. So yeah, on the next slide, I think we've got sort of a few stats around the kind of some of the underlying economic factors. So there's I think two things to think about here, really. So one of them is I guess the underlying economics, and then the other is kind of what's happened in the last few years. So the pandemic and the cost of living crisis. So just, yeah, kind of looking at that kind of first bit. So I think we all know kind of real pay hasn't really been you know, increasing. We've seen that, you know, kind of push back across lots of sectors, but also you know, you've got sort of zero hours contracts, kind of lots of low paid work, kind of, yeah, that sort of thing happening. So kind of, you know, in work it isn't really paying, and then benefit levels are also really not kept up. So and yeah, particularly with benefits as well, there's a kind of a specific issue around debt deductions, which is where people have a certain amount of their kind of UC taken out because of a debt before they even get it, and that could be because they've maybe received some of the payment early when they started getting universal credit, but it's also because of it could be an overpayment on tax credits. So you know, something that people didn't even know they you know, they had a debt they didn't even know they had. So yeah, there's lots of stuff around benefits, but essentially, I guess the key point is that it's not, you know, people aren't getting enough money from it, basically. And yeah, there's a number of organisations campaigning on that. But yeah, just yeah, and as I was saying, yeah, that citizens' advice stat around how many people are now in a negative budget. And then the other side of it is just on the next slide, which is just some of what's happened kind of during the cost of living crisis. So there's 3.7 billion pounds worth of energy debt that's built up, and that's yeah, a new stat that Ofgem just put out the other day. 6 billion pounds worth of council tax. Yeah, there's and as I was saying, sort of a lot of people relying a lot on kind of credit as well to pay for essentials. But yeah, what are the kind of impacts of that? Just to kind of get a bit more into what really happens when or who that's impacting on, and kind of what are some of the, I guess, sort of cross-cutting issues and kind of some of the intersectional issues with people getting into debt. So just, yeah, on the next slide, we've just got a kind of, sorry, that one's a bit wordy actually. But yeah, essentially, it kind of, this doesn't affect everyone kind of equally. So kind of workers, carers, parents, communities of colour are all kind of disproportionately affected by high levels of household debt. And one of the kind of key things or one of the key impacts that being in lots of debt has is the kind of mental health strain. Yeah, 50% of people in debt have a mental health problem, and every year over 400,000 people in England consider taking their own life. You know, and which is, yeah, just a massive kind of terrifying statistic. But I think there's obviously lots of kind of interlinking factors there, but the stress and kind of stigma attached to being in debt is kind of, I guess, like a key facet of how it feels, and kind of one of the biggest impacts that that people have. That's a bit about I guess what the UK's household debt crisis looks like at the moment. And then I was just going to talk a little bit as well about kind of, I guess, some of the work that we're doing, and also some of the I guess what we want the government to do now. So we work both in at a kind of local level. We kind of use community organising to bring groups of people together to campaign on debt issues that they want to work on, that they want to highlight. And we have groups in Manchester, London, and Glasgow. And I'd say that I think one of the kind of good things about this work is not just that people are coming together to campaign on debt, but also it's given lots of people a space to talk about some of those kind of more difficult issues as well. And we've seen some of the groups kind of I guess sort of is more of a, you know, acting together in solidarity, and it's more kind of, yeah, the having that space to come together with people who are experiencing the same thing, and kind of feeling free to talk about it, and feeling free to kind of take action on it as well. So they've had some really good wins over the last few years. So in Glasgow, the group got £300,000 worth of school meal debt written off, which was really fantastic. And then in Manchester, just earlier this year, they won a ban on kind of bailiffs for kind of almost for 48,000 households that are in receipt of council tax support. So kind of some of the more kind of vulnerable households aren't going to get visited by bailiffs anymore in Manchester, which is really great. And then, yeah, we've also been running kind of national campaigns to kind of write off energy debt, and doing quite a lot of work on insolvency practice as well, which is one of the ways that people can sort of get out of debt. But there's quite a lot of work that needs to be done there on that. And I think this was shared as one of the kind of documents ahead of this session, but we ran a kind of a bit of co-produced policy work last year and early this year to pull together a set of demands in the run up to the election. And those are on the next slide. But these were sort of basically the kind of all-encompassing demands that kind of participants wanted to see. So fair debt solutions, so everyone can have a fresh start, and to be treated with dignity and protected from exploitation and harassment of creditors, debt collectors and bailiffs. And that yeah, again and again, that really is one of the issues that we see coming through, that this is one of the most stressful parts of being in debt. And yeah, kind of more needs to be done to regulate that area. And then an end to people being pushed into debt just to pay for the food, energy, and housing they need. Yeah, so those are the kind of big three all-encompassing demands that came out of this process that we were campaigning on this year, and then we'll sort of continue to campaign on now that the new government is there. But yeah, that was, I think, hopefully not too quick a summary. Those are kind of those are sort of all of my slides. So I hope that gives enough of an overview of sort of some of the key issues, and enough to kind of base a bit of the conversation of around the kind of the rights aspects in this kind of area.
Thank you so much for that, Eva. That was really great. And like, if I'm right, 10 million people is about 1 in 7 people across the UK, I think.
Yeah, no, it's a lot.
Really important to think of the scale of it. I
Yeah.
also thought it was so important how you really showed how these rights are so interrelated, because the impact of debt on other things such as health and things like that, and also that kind of the people who so often, the groups of people who so often experience barriers to these rights are the same. You know, when we're talking about people of color, when we're talking about disabled people, when we're talking about women, that kind of renters, those kind of groups are the same ones that come up all the time. Thank you so much for that, Eva. And I'm going to pass shortly on to our second speaker, Angela Phillips, but I just want to introduce her first. Angela is the Senior Policy and Engagement Officer at Carers NI. She has a background in public health policy development, research, and advocacy. Angela leads the Carer Policy Forum, ensuring carers' voices are central to the research and campaigning of Carers NI. And whilst in her current role at Carers NI, Angela has built up their evidence base and policy position on caring and employment, and has also been really instrumental in the campaign for paid carers leave. So Angela, I'm delighted to welcome you today.
Thank you very much. I'll just try and share my slides here. And can you see that okay? Grand. And apologies for the slightly hoarse voice. I've been off last week with a bad cold. So in terms of what I want to talk about today, I wanted to cover this really from the perspective of unpaid carers. So I wanted to talk a little bit about just what we mean by unpaid care and who provides unpaid care. And then I went about looking at the question of, do unpaid carers in Northern Ireland have an adequate standard of living? And if they don't, what can be done to help achieve an adequate standard of living amongst this group? So unpaid carers are people who provide care for sick, for ill, for disabled or older family members, friends or neighbours, and they don't receive any pay to do so. Now, they're a very diverse population. They encompass child and young adult carers, right through to carers of pension age. And for some, their caring role can just be a few hours a week, but for others, it's much more, and for some, it involves caring round the clock. And for some, their caring journey is just a few years, but for others, it's a lifetime commitment. And we know that there are about 220,000 unpaid carers in Northern Ireland, which is where I'm based. That's about 1 in 8 of the population. The majority are of working age, and in fact, a significant majority are aged between 40 and 64. Again, the majority are women, about 60%, and about 1 in 3 of them provide care for 50 plus hours a week. And if you have a look around, 2 in 3 of us on the call today will be a carer in our lifetime. Now, we know that our unpaid carers in Northern Ireland save our health and social care system £5.8 billion per year in care costs. But yet that care that they provide often comes at a great personal cost to themselves, affecting them not only whilst they're providing care, but also having significant effects on their future finances and on their health. So I've listed here 4 areas that providing unpaid care can have an effect on in terms of the carer. So in terms of employment, finances, health and well-being, and educational opportunities. And I wanted to drill down really on the first 2, finances and employment. So from research that we've done, we know that 1 in 4 unpaid carers in Northern Ireland are currently living in poverty. Now that's much higher than the rate amongst non-carers in Northern Ireland, which is 17%. But it's also higher than the rate amongst carers in the rest of the UK. And in terms of how that manifests itself in the daily lives of carers, we know that 1 in 5 carers are struggling to afford the cost of food. And you can see here, the carer in question here is saying that she had breakfast cereal for 3 meals so that the person that she cared for could have their lunches for the week. Nearly 1 in 3 carers are cutting back on essentials like heating. And again, this carer talks about not being able to afford oil for the tank, but being far too embarrassed to say that they haven't got the money for that. We know that 1 in 10 carers can't afford utility bills. And this carer clearly outlines the difficult decisions that they're having to make. I know I can't afford to eat, drive, heat the house, and use electric. I just don't know what's going to happen. We know that 16% tell us that they're in debt due to caring, and this carer feels that she's borrowed money to the level that will affect me until old age and will affect my kids' quality of life too. And nearly 70% are worried about their ability to save and plan ahead. And this carer is saying that she's just not able to save. So when big bills come along, like having to buy a new washing machine, she doesn't know where she's going to get the money to afford that. And again, we've done quite a bit of work looking at what the core drivers are of this poverty amongst unpaid carers in Northern Ireland. And there are 3 big drivers. First of all, the high inescapable extra costs of caring. So sometimes you may need to have the heating on much more because the person that you care for feels the cold. You may need to leave the lights on all the time because you need to avoid shadows because the person has dementia, or you need to avoid fall risks, or you need to replace clothing much more frequently because there's much more wear and tear. Barriers to employment, where carers really struggle to enter or to stay in the labour market, and low social security support. And we're talking about carers allowance there. So I just wanted to look a little bit about the last 2. So carers allowance is the main social security benefit for carers. It's the safety net, but it's a really low benefit. It's about £81.90 per week. It has very strict eligibility criteria and a really harsh earnings threshold where you can earn £151 a week. If you earn more than that, you lose your benefit entirely. And what we know, that nearly 1 in 2 carers in Northern Ireland who are receiving carers allowance are currently living in poverty. And we know, if we look at the indices I talked about before, cutting back on essentials, struggling to eat, experiencing debt, can't afford your bills, that those are much higher amongst recipients of carers allowance than carers in general. So what I would say is that if this is the safety net, it's really not doing its job. Now, if we look at employment and unpaid carers, carers' rights and support in employment are very limited, and they're even more limited in Northern Ireland than they are in the rest of the UK. And carers really struggle to balance caring responsibilities with employment. And what we see is that 1 in 3 people with caring responsibilities leave work because of caring. 1 in 4 take on less hours, and 1 in 6 turn down promotions or take on a job that they're less qualified for because of their caring role. But for many of these people, They tell us they want to work, and if they had the support to do so, then they could. And this inability to work affects these people financially now, but it also affects them in the future because they cannot save and they cannot pay into pension pots for the future. And we see from the statistics here that unpaid carers are much less likely to be in employment, and they're much less likely to be in full-time employment. And this inability to take on employment is a real significant driver of poverty amongst this population. And over half of carers who are out of work in Northern Ireland live in poverty, 55%, compared to 14% of carers who are in work. And I've talked to you a little bit before there about the financial difficulty this poses to carers in the here and now, but also the cycle of poverty that sets up, where they can't save for the future, they can't pay into pension pots, so they don't have any pension when they retire. So I asked a question at the beginning, do unpaid carers in Northern Ireland have an adequate standard of living? And I would say for a large majority, they don't. And when we're looking at things of what can we do to help this, what we would say, what we need is a holistic approach to supporting unpaid carers, cross-departmental approach. So supports such as workplace supports, paid carers leave, flexible working policies, social care reform with reform of carers allowance, both in terms of its monetary amount, but also its eligibility criteria and its earnings threshold, and social care reform, so people have adequate social care such as domiciliary care or respite that enables them to take on employment. And that all of this would allow carers who want to and who are able to enter and remain in the labour market, to bring in an adequate source of income to support them and the person that they care for. And by giving them these supports, we also reduce this juggling act that they're having to do at the moment and reduce their levels of stress and ill health. By bringing in the income, it reduces poverty and debt amongst carers. And we would also say that has not only benefits to carers, but also far-reaching benefits to state, to government, to employers. And a lot of the narrative around at the moment is how much these policy changes at the top of this slide would cost to implement. But we're doing quite a bit of work at the moment looking at the benefits to business and the benefits to government of implementing these sorts of policy changes. And I would suggest that they would pay for themselves. So in conclusion, we believe at Carers NI that carers have the same right to opportunities as everyone else. They shouldn't be disadvantaged by taking on a caring role. They save the health and social care system billions of pounds per year in care costs. And as a society, we need to value them and we need to value the contribution that they're making. But the reality is that many unpaid carers are under severe pressure. They're at breaking point and they're providing care at the detriment of their own health and well-being, their careers, their finances, and their standard of living. And valuing and supporting carers should be a holistic, cross-departmental approach. That's not only the right thing to do in terms of the right thing for carers, but also will bring benefits to business, government, and the economy. And ultimately, will give us a more equal, a healthier, a happier, and a more productive society. So that's me. I'm just going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much for that, Angela. There was so much in that, the kind of highlighting the unseen costs, the unseen impacts, including those future impacts, and also something that's going to impact most of us in our lifetimes when it's 2 and 3 people. And again, really interesting the intersection being seen there, how it impacts across so many parts of a person's life, much like what Eva was talking about with debt. And it's also this really interesting thing that, you know, all that you're asking for is practical, reasonable solutions that are in decision makers' interests, but that kind of frustration that it still doesn't seem enough to make change happen. So thank you so much for working on this and doing that work, and also that feeling that you're left with, that perhaps decision makers get away with this because of course carers are going to keep caring because they love the people that they care for, and what is their alternative, and you know, the fear that we're taking advantage of that. But thank you so much for that. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to speed on quickly and pass over to Lindesay Mace. And Lindesay works for the independent anti-poverty and social justice charity, Quaker Social Action, where she co-manages their funeral poverty project, Down to Earth, and is the influencing lead in that project. Lindesay has been working on funeral poverty for over 6 years and has submitted reports to both the United Nations and the European Committee of Social Rights, setting out the impact of funeral poverty on people's economic, social and cultural rights. Lindesay has been a guest speaker on Radio 4's You and Yours and their All-Consuming podcast, and featured in 2 ITV Tonight programmes investigating the cost of funerals. So Lindesay, delighted to hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Helen. Thanks for having me, and to everyone for being here. I'm just going to share my slides, hopefully. Hopefully everyone can see that. Yeah, it's been so interesting already hearing those 2 presentations, and so many thoughts going around. I'm very interested to hear what people have to say later. I'm going to talk about funeral poverty and its impact on people's standard of living. So just to start with a very sort of brief overview of funeral poverty and what it is. So it's when someone is faced with paying for a funeral and isn't able to afford it. And since at least 2016, the financial services company Sun Life has been tracking the proportion of people who face notable financial concerns when paying for a funeral, and found last year that it sat at 1 in 5 people. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, especially given the cost of living crisis, that proportion has risen every year for the last 4 years. In terms of, part of the landscape of that is obviously funeral prices. And the funeral industry is almost completely unregulated. And that includes there being no check on prices. So Sun Life has tracked funeral prices since 2004, particularly the cost of what they call a basic attended funeral. I'd just like to say that we prefer to use the word simple, as we feel it sort of is perhaps holds a bit less potential sort of judgment factor in it. But Sun Life uses the word basic. You can see there that the average cost of a basic attended funeral has risen 126% since 2004. So that's more than milk, wages, even house prices. So significantly more than inflation. And there you can see those average prices. On the sort of far right is the average price for an unattended cremation specifically, and that's where there is no one present at the crematorium. And you can see that's significantly cheaper than an attended funeral. So what about government support? So some people who are in receipt of an income-related benefit or tax credit can access support from the government through the funeral expenses payment in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and the funeral support payment in Scotland. But the payment amount has not kept up with prices. So Scotland's payment is slightly more generous, but the average award there still pays only slightly more than 50% of the average cost of a basic attended funeral. Now, as you saw on the last slide, as I said, unattended funerals are much cheaper. And across the UK, a funeral payment will generally cover the cost of that, though that isn't always the case. But people shouldn't be forced to have an unattended funeral if that isn't what they actually want, just because they don't have the funds. And it's important to note that all of that is only for people who can get a funeral payment from the government. So in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland specifically, thousands of people who are in receipt of a qualifying benefit, so are in receipt of an income-related benefit like universal credit, thousands of them can't access a funeral payment due to the incredibly complex eligibility criteria that is frankly divorced from real life situations. And that's in contrast to Scotland, where 40% more people can access a payment. So significantly better off north of the border in this case. And then, of course, that's plus the fact that across the UK, anyone who isn't getting an income-related benefit is automatically excluded, whether they're a student, a pensioner on state pension, or a worker on a low income. If you're not getting one of those qualifying benefits, you've no chance of getting a funeral payment, and that's regardless of whether or not you can actually afford a funeral. So what does all this mean for people? What is the impact of funeral poverty? So the core of our service at Down to Earth is actually a funeral costs advice service. And I work alongside that with the influencing and the strategic work. But so on the helpline, on the advice service, we hear about these impacts every day. And so I'd like to share a story with you. So when Jamal and Layla's daughter died in her 40s, they didn't know what to do. Layla had never been able to work, as she had always been her daughter's carer, but Layla had a serious health condition herself. So her husband, Jamal, hadn't been able to work either for some years while caring for her. Faced with a funeral bill of nearly £3,500 and ineligible for a government funeral payment, they used £1,500 of their state pension, their PIP, and their carer's allowance to pay the funeral deposit. That left them with £2,000 still to pay. They then tried to pay off the balance in instalments that they couldn't really afford. All this meant they were unable to pay for proper food, putting Layla's health at risk, or to keep up with their rent, making them afraid that they would be evicted. Because already struggling to make ends meet before their daughter's death, they had some rent arrears, but were managing these through a payment plan. But when they used their income to pay the funeral deposit, they couldn't keep up with the agreement, and the landlord started court proceedings. Once referred to us, we helped them access a food bank and charitable funds to cover the extra rent arrears they'd accrued in order to stop the legal proceedings. And also, of course, a grant to pay off the funeral bill. That meant Layla finally felt able to visit her daughter's grave, because she hadn't felt she had the right to do that while they still owed money for it. And that is, I guess, an everyday right that perhaps we don't think about, which is that everyone should have the right to grieve in peace. Whereas what we hear a lot of the time is that all people can focus on is how are they going to pay the funeral costs. And that really leaves them with no mental space to grieve. But this is just one story. Sun Life found that last year, among those people who faced notable financial concerns when paying for a funeral, that 33% had to cut back on essentials like food, and 25% struggled to pay essential bills and rent. And it's not only people who are arranging a funeral who face these kinds of hardships, but also those who are dying. So in my 2 minutes left, I'd just like to end with Helen and Graham's story. Helen was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer, aged 58. She'd previously worked as a bus driver for 20 years, but a relationship breakdown left her finding it difficult to cope, and she hadn't worked since. As Helen didn't have any savings and knew that her brother and sister, although working, were on low incomes and so wouldn't be able to afford her funeral, she did what she could to save money from her benefits in her final months. This meant she often went without proper food and heating while she was dying. Helen was ill for about 18 months before her health then rapidly declined and she died aged just 59. On her death, her brother Graham found that she had managed to save an incredible £1,800, but it is difficult to imagine what she suffered in order to do that. Her siblings also experienced the distress of knowing that she had suffered more in her final months because of worrying about the funeral costs. I'm just going to stop sharing. So, as with all forms of poverty, there are so many underlying factors and problems that need fixing. But in terms of a couple of funeral-related solutions specifically, we are working on getting the amount of government funeral payments increased, their eligibility criteria reformed so they reach more people, and on getting full-scale regulation of the funeral industry with the possibility of price controls. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Lindesay, and I'm sure all of us are really impacted by those stories that you shared. They're truly heart-wrenching. I thought it was really interesting as well, the kind of echo that we're hearing throughout these presentations of people's payments not keeping up with the actual costs of things and people having to make up the shortfall and the impact that that then has on their lives, these kind of cycles of poverty. So thank you so much for sharing that, Lindesay. That was hugely impactful. I'm going to introduce our last speaker for today, and then after that we're going to take a short break and then go into our breakout rooms. But our last speaker is Luke D. Graham, and Luke is a lecturer in public law and human rights at the University of Manchester. Luke researches destitution and the right to adequate clothing. So I'll pass to you, Luke.
Thank you very much, Helen. I'll just try and share my screen now. If maybe I could get a thumbs up, I can see you on my screen. Are you able to see this? Wonderful. Thank you so much. So just start a timer to make sure I stay within my time. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today on the idea of lacking access to adequate clothing. But also thank you to the other speakers for some really powerful testimonies. It's been really interesting to see how poverty cuts across so many different aspects of people's life course. So today I'm going to focus on adequate clothing specifically. And the reason I do this is because, as Helen alluded to in her introduction today, the right to adequate clothing has been really very much neglected both by the human rights community in practice, but also by academics who are working in the space of human rights and everyday rights and so forth. So I came onto clothing whilst researching destitution, while seeking to understand which specific human rights relate to destitution. And clothing is quite central to understandings of destitution outside of human rights. And then when I went to explore the right, there was very little there. And so I've been working on this for a few years since then. So why is clothing important to begin? So firstly, clothing is incredibly and intimately interconnected with human health and well-being. It cuts across physical well-being. It protects us from our environment, whether that's from the weather or whether that's from our work environment, so personal protective equipment, for example. It's also beyond physical well-being. It is very closely connected to identity. So when we choose to dress each day, very often we might make decisions about clothing to convey ideas about ourselves that we want the rest of the world to also perceive. In this sense, the idea that clothing is incredibly and highly visible. It's often, and a great deal of research shows this, it's often one of the first things that we perceive about somebody when we meet them for the first time. not having the right clothing in a particular social setting, such as a funeral, if you're unable to attain a black suit with a white shirt and a black tie, which is traditional male dress at a funeral, this can be quite stigmatizing and harmful for individuals as well. And because of this importance of clothing, it's very much important to the enjoyment of many human rights. It's a prerequisite for the enjoyment of human rights beyond clothing. We need it to participate in society and to avoid stigma. Examples might be school uniforms. There's been lots of very high-profile news articles over the last few years about the cost of school uniform suppliers as well, for example, like the Scottish Government school uniform grant and various policies that are being introduced. And straight away, there's a link to education and the right to education there as well, isn't there? But there's so many other rights that clothing is central to or allows the full enjoyment of. And because of this, clothing really has been described as a basic right. And this is a category of right proposed by Henry Shue, who's an academic a theorist working on rights, arguing that these specific rights belong to all human beings, as all human rights do, but they have an special importance to ensure that people can live a dignified life. And clothing is contained in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It's also contained in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it's also contained in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So it's named explicitly in 3 of the 9 core UN human rights treaties. But despite this, as I've alluded to, it's very much underexplored. What we do know is that clothing can be accessed via the market. The UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has stressed that they would prefer clothing to be accessed via the market. The implication of that is that clothing must be affordable. And so this, therefore, has close links to decent work and pay, close links to social security, close links to how people are able to prioritize their budgets and various things, so how large their budget is in the first place. So very closely tied to poverty. And it is, and I stress this, it's part of poverty. Lack of access to adequate clothing is one part of broader poverty. It's a symptom of underlying structures in which people are forced to experience poverty. And it's a very visible symptom, as I've alluded to already. Dirty, worn, damaged, ill-fitting clothing, they're all things that even subconsciously we see and we recognize, and we may judge and stigmatize people because of this. But clothing, I think, is a particularly problematic issue because we talk about people having to make the choice between eating food and heating their home, paying rent. When people have limited budgets due to poverty, clothing is not a priority purchase as compared to rent and as compared to food. And therefore, income may be prioritized elsewhere. And ultimately, it means there's a lack of affordability of clothing, insufficient wages, insufficient social security, to reiterate that point. And all of this means that not just when it comes to clothing, but also when it comes to the right to just and favourable conditions of work, also when it comes to the right to social security, the state is not fulfilling its obligations. If individuals cannot afford the basic necessities of life, that means that work and or, in some combination, social security are not set at the appropriate levels. And particularly in the UK, we do have clothing poverty amidst plenty. Many people are unable to afford to purchase adequate clothing through the market, yet we have such a surplus of clothing. It's a huge industry. Even second-hand clothing via charity shops might be unaffordable, and we see this increasingly. That's if they have your size. If you're particularly tall or you have a particular body shape, an uncommon size, so I don't know, not a men's 34 waist, there's a good chance that charity shops might not have clothing that fits you. And at the same time, many charity shop donations end up abroad, and we export our textile waste, which we can't recycle, to often the developing world as well. And so because of this, we have had a rise in clothing charity across the country. So we increasingly now have clothing banks, organizations who are providing clothing free of charge to people in need. But the very need for clothing charity once again shows that obligations are not being met more broadly under international human rights law. And so I'll come to a close there. And thank you for listening, and thank you for your patience. I apologise for being slightly late.
Thank you so much for that, Luke. An absolute masterclass in how these rights are interdependent and impacting one impacts so many others, and something that all our other speakers have touched on. And also just so interesting that all our speakers touched on this idea of dignity that's so central to our human rights, but just really laid out the barriers that people are facing to that. And I think it's so important what Luke was saying there. You know, all of our speakers as well have touched on this idea of shame or of stigma. But as Luke said, it's not that these people are failing, it's that the state is not fulfilling its obligations. The state is breaking its promises in terms of human rights. And just brings me back to what Eva was saying about unleashing that power of communities to really bring that back. But I am going to stop for a bit, give you all a 5-minute break to do what you need to do. And we'll come back at 2 minutes past, at which point you're all going to be in breakout groups.